Canada has just sent Washington a message that could become much bigger than a simple trade disagreement. Canadian oil is not going to be treated like a political bargaining chip. And that matters because the United States does not simply buy Canadian oil and forget about it. American refineries, especially those built to process heavy crude, have spent years depending on Canadian supply. Now, as tensions between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney continue, the pressure on Canada over energy is becoming impossible to ignore. Trump has repeatedly pushed the idea that America has more choices and does not have to depend on Canada. But there is a major difference between saying America can find another supplier and actually replacing millions of barrels of Canadian crude. Canada knows that difference. And Ottawa appears determined to protect its position as a reliable energy supplier rather than surrendering control of its oil exports because of political pressure. That creates a strange situation. America needs affordable and dependable crude. Canada has enormous amounts of it. Yet the two countries are increasingly arguing over the very energy relationship that has benefited both sides for decades. The real question is not simply whether Canada rejected an American demand. The bigger question is this: what happens to American refineries if Washington pushes Canada too far? Because Canadian oil is already deeply connected to the American energy system, and the numbers tell a story that political speeches cannot easily erase. The United States was importing roughly 4 million barrels a day of Canadian crude on a 4-week average basis during much of 2026. That is not a tiny amount. And that is a major part of the North American energy machine. And if that relationship becomes unstable, the consequences could reach far beyond government offices in Ottawa and Washington. For decades, Canada has been one of America's most important energy partners. The reason is simple. Canada has oil. America has enormous refining capacity, and the two systems were built to work together. Canadian producers, particularly in Alberta, produce large amounts of heavy crude. Many American refineries were designed to process exactly that kind of oil. That makes the relationship much harder to change than a politician's statement might suggest. A refinery cannot simply wake up one morning and decide to use a completely different type of crude without consequences. The oil has different qualities. Refineries have different equipment. Pipelines connect specific producing regions with specific refining centers. The entire system has been built over decades. That is why America's relationship with Canadian oil is not simply about buying barrels from a neighbor. It is about infrastructure. It is about pipelines. It is about refinery design. And it is about geography. Canada is right next door. That matters. Canadian crude can move into the United States through an enormous network of pipelines reaching major refining centers in the Midwest and beyond. The alternative is often more complicated. Oil may have to travel much farther, it may cost more to transport, and the replacement crude may not have the same characteristics as Canadian crude. This is where the political argument collides with reality. Washington can say America has options, and technically America does. But having options does not mean those options are cheap, fast, or easy. That distinction is critical. Canada's position is also complicated. Prime Minister Mark Carney has previously rejected the idea of deliberately cutting Canadian oil exports to the United States as a trade weapon. His argument is that Canada's reputation as a dependable supplier is valuable. That is an important point. So now comes the part that could worry American refiners. The United States has alternatives to Canadian oil, but replacing Canadian crude on a large scale is not something that can happen overnight. That is especially important because American refineries are operating in a world where crude supply is already under pressure from global events. Recent U.S. government data showed something unusual. American crude inventories jumped by 17.4 million barrels in the week ending August 7th. At first glance, that might sound like America has more than enough oil. U.S. crude exports fell sharply during that week, while imports, including Canadian crude, increased. That tells us something important. America's energy market is not isolated from the rest of the world. Oil moves constantly. Refineries need the right crude. Pipelines need to keep moving. Exports, imports, and inventories can change quickly. And when one part of that system is disrupted, another part has to respond. That is why Canadian oil remains so important. Canada is not simply another supplier sitting on the other side of the world. It is America's closest major source of crude, and U.S. refineries can receive that supply through an established network. That gives Canadian oil a major advantage. It also gives Canada leverage, but Ottawa has to be careful about how it uses that leverage. If Canada deliberately threatens American energy security, it could push Washington toward even more aggressive policies. And if Washington pressures Canada too hard, it could encourage Canada to look for more customers outside the United States. That is the dangerous middle ground. Neither country necessarily wants to destroy the energy relationship, but both countries now have reasons to reduce their dependence on the other. And that is how a trade dispute can slowly become an energy strategy. The United States wants security. Canada wants economic independence. There is another problem Washington has to consider. Canadian oil is not easily replaced by simply turning on another supplier. This is where the refinery issue becomes so important. Some American refineries are specifically equipped to process heavier crude. Canadian oil fits that system extremely well. So if Canadian supply becomes more expensive or less reliable, refiners may have to search for alternatives. And alternatives can come from places such as Venezuela or other international suppliers. But that brings another problem. Global oil markets are already dealing with geopolitical risks. Shipping rates can be disrupted. Production can change. Refineries can shut down. Governments can impose sanctions. And wars can suddenly change where millions of barrels of oil are available. That means depending more heavily on overseas crude does not automatically make America safer. In some cases, it can create a different kind of risk. Canadian oil has one enormous advantage. It comes from a friendly neighboring country. The supply does not have to cross an ocean. It does not depend on a dangerous international shipping route. And the United States has decades of infrastructure connecting Canadian producers with American refiners. That is why statements about America not needing Canadian oil can sound much simpler than the actual energy system. America may not need every barrel, but American refiners clearly value the barrels that fit their system. Even the U.S. ambassador to Canada has acknowledged the importance of the relationship. Pete Hoekstra said America needs oil and described Canada as one of the best places for the United States to buy it. And that does not mean Washington has no bargaining power. It does not mean Canada can dictate everything, but it does show why the energy relationship cannot be reduced to a simple question of who needs whom more. Both sides need the relationship in different way, but Canada is also changing. For years, Canada's energy system was heavily focused on the American market. That made sense. America was right next door. The pipelines were already there. The demand was enormous, and Canadian producers had a dependable customer. But the political relationship has changed. Tariffs have changed the conversation. Trade threats have changed the conversation. And repeated arguments over Canadian resources have made Ottawa look more seriously at other markets. This is where Canada's energy strategy becomes interesting. And if Canada can send more oil to the Pacific coast, it can potentially reach customers in Asia. That would give Canadian producers more choices, and more choices mean more bargaining power. It would also reduce Canada's dependence on one buyer. That does not mean Canada is preparing to abandon the United States. The United States will remain an enormous customer, but Canada now has a stronger reason to ask a simple question. Why should one country control so much of Canada's energy market? That question has become more powerful because Canada has already invested in expanding its ability to move oil to the Pacific, and every new route gives Canadian producers another option. For Washington, this creates a difficult calculation. If American pressure convinces Canada to build stronger relationships with Asian buyers, the United States could eventually lose some of the advantage it has enjoyed for decades. That would be a major strategic shift. America would still have access to oil, but it might have to compete more aggressively for Canadian barrels, and competition could affect prices. This is why the current dispute is bigger than one demand. It is about what the North American energy system will look like 5 or 10 years from now. Will Canada remain overwhelmingly tied to the American market? Or will Canada become a global oil supplier with customers across the Pacific? For President Trump, the situation presents a very different challenge. Trump has made energy independence a major part of his political message. The idea is straightforward. America should produce more energy. America should depend less on foreign suppliers, and America should have the power to negotiate from a position of strength. But Canadian oil creates an unusual problem for that argument. Canada is a foreign country, yet it is also America's closest major energy partner. So reducing dependence on Canada does not necessarily mean reducing dependence on foreign oil. America could simply replace Canadian barrels with barrels from somewhere else. That could mean more imports from Latin America, more purchases from other international suppliers, or more pressure to increase domestic production. But producing more American oil is not exactly the same as producing the type of oil that every refinery needs. And building new pipelines, expanding refinery capacity, and changing infrastructure takes time. This is where the political promise meets the physical reality of the energy industry. Oil cannot simply be ordered like a new piece of equipment. The wells must produce it. Pipelines must carry it. Ports must move it. Refineries must process it. And consumers must eventually receive the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel made from it. That entire chain has to work. A disruption anywhere can create problems somewhere else. And American refiners know this better than almost anyone. That is why a dispute with Canada can make energy executives nervous even when there is no immediate shortage of gasoline. Markets react to expectations. So if refiners believe future Canadian supply could become more expensive or less reliable, they have to start planning today. They may search for alternative suppliers. They may change purchasing contracts. They may adjust refinery operations, and they may pass some higher costs through the market. For President Trump, the situation presents a very different challenge. Trump has made energy independence a major part of his political message. The idea is straightforward. America should produce more energy. America should depend less on foreign suppliers. And America should have the power to negotiate from a position of strength. But Canadian oil creates an unusual problem for that argument. Canada is a foreign country, yet it is also America's closest major energy partner. So reducing dependence on Canada does not necessarily mean reducing dependence on foreign oil. America could simply replace Canadian barrels with barrels from somewhere else. That could mean more imports from Latin America, more purchases from other international suppliers, or more pressure to increase domestic production. But producing more American oil is not exactly the same as producing the type of oil that every refinery needs. And building new pipelines, expanding refinery capacity, and changing infrastructure takes time. This is where the political promise meets the physical reality of the energy industry. Oil cannot simply be ordered like a new piece of equipment. The wells must produce it. Pipelines must carry it. Ports must move it. Refineries must process it. And consumers must eventually receive the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel made from it. That entire chain has to work. A disruption anywhere can create problems somewhere else. And American refiners know this better than almost anyone. That is why a dispute with Canada can make energy executives nervous even when there is no immediate shortage of gasoline. Markets react to expectations. So if refiners believe future Canadian supply could become more expensive or less reliable, they have to start planning today. They may search for alternative suppliers. They may change purchasing contracts. They may adjust refinery operations, and they may pass some higher costs through the market. And then there is the issue of tariffs. The oil dispute is happening at the same time as a much wider trade fight between Canada and the United States. Washington has threatened additional tariffs on Canadian goods. Canadian officials have been negotiating with U.S. trade representatives to avoid another escalation. And that creates a dangerous possibility. Trade policy and energy policy could begin feeding each other. Imagine American tariffs making Canadian products more expensive. Canada responds with its own measures. Then Washington increases pressure on Canadian energy, and Canada looks for more customers overseas. American refiners face higher costs. Businesses react, and suddenly a disagreement that started with trade becomes an energy problem. And that is the chain both governments have to avoid. Because Canada and the United States are not ordinary trading partners. Their economies are deeply connected. Goods cross the border every day. Energy crosses the border every day. Supply chains stretch across both countries. A problem in one country can quickly become a problem in the other. And that is why the current negotiations matter so much. The two governments may disagree sharply, but the economic reality forces them to keep talking. And oil is one of the biggest reasons. Canada knows the United States remains its most important energy customer. America knows Canadian oil remains extremely useful to its refining system. So neither side has an easy path to complete separation. This is not a simple divorce. It is more like two neighbors who have spent decades sharing the same infrastructure and suddenly decide they need more independence. They can build new systems. They can find new partners. They can change their habits, but it takes time. And while that happens, they still have to live next door to each other. And that is why the latest Canadian resistance should not be viewed as an isolated event. And here is the part that could surprise many Americans. Canada may actually have more leverage than it appears to have, not because Canada can simply shut off the oil. In fact, Canadian leaders have been cautious about doing that. The leverage comes from Canada's ability to choose where its future energy growth goes. If Canada builds more export routes to the Pacific, Canadian producers gain access to more international customers. If those customers are willing to pay competitive prices, the United States has to compete. That changes the relationship. For decades, geography gave America a huge advantage. Canada had oil. America had the nearest large market. But new infrastructure can change geography. Once Canadian oil can reach Asia more easily, the Pacific becomes part of the equation. Suddenly, the choice is no longer simply Canada or America. It becomes America, Asia, and potentially other global markets. That is a much bigger energy game, and Canada knows it. At the same time, Canada cannot ignore the risks. The American market is enormous. Canadian producers cannot replace that customer overnight. So Ottawa has to move carefully. The smartest strategy may not be to punish America. It may be to create alternatives while continuing to supply America reliably. And that approach would give Canada more freedom without destroying a relationship worth billions of dollars. And that may be what makes this moment so important. The biggest change may not be a sudden cutoff. It may be a slow shift in Canada's strategy. More markets, more pipelines, more buyers, more choices, and less dependence on a single customer. If that happens, the balance of power in North American energy could look very different several years from now. The United States would still be a giant energy market. Canada would still be a major supplier, but the relationship would become less one-sided. Canada is not necessarily walking away. For American consumers, the biggest question is simple. So, will any of this actually affect the price at the gas pump? The honest answer is that nobody can say exactly how the dispute will develop. Oil prices depend on many things. Global production matters. Wars matter. Shipping routes matter. Refinery outages matter. Demand matters. Inventories matter. And government policy matters. So it would be wrong to claim that one Canadian decision automatically means gasoline prices will explode. But it would also be wrong to pretend the Canadian relationship does not matter. Canadian crude is deeply connected to the American energy system, and American refineries are already operating in a complicated global environment. Recent data showed U.S. crude inventories rising sharply, while crude exports fell and imports increased. At the same time, global refining markets have been dealing with major disruptions and geopolitical risks, and that means the system has less room for unnecessary shocks. If Canadian crude remains available and trade continues normally, refiners have one of the most reliable sources of supply available. But if political pressure turns into actual restrictions, tariffs, or disruptions, the market has to adjust. And markets do not always adjust smoothly. That is the warning. The goal should not be to frighten Americans about an immediate fuel shortage. There is no evidence that a sudden nationwide gasoline shortage is happening simply because of this dispute. The real issue is longer term. If Canada and America continue moving toward energy separation, both countries will spend more money creating alternatives. Canada will need new markets. America will need new sources. Companies will need new infrastructure, and consumers may eventually pay part of the bill. That is why this story deserves attention. The cost of a trade war is not always visible on the day a government announces. So where does this leave Canada and the United States? The answer is uncomfortable for both sides. America has enormous energy resources. Canada has enormous energy resources. Both countries have powerful economies. Both have alternatives. But neither country can completely ignore the other without paying a price. That is the reality Washington now has to confront. Canada can be pressured, but Canada can also diversify. America can find other oil, but replacing Canadian crude at scale is not always simple. Canada can search for customers in Asia, but America remains its biggest and most established energy market. And that is why the smartest outcome may not be a dramatic break. It may be negotiation. The two countries can fight over tariffs. They can argue over trade. They can disagree over energy. But at some point, economics forces reality into the room. American refiners need reliable crude. Canadian producers need reliable customers. Consumers need affordable fuel. Businesses need predictable costs. And both governments need stable supply chains. That is the common ground. The current dispute may therefore become a turning point. For Canada, it is a chance to prove that its energy future does not have to depend on one market. For the United States, it is a reminder that having energy power does not mean every supplier can be replaced instantly. And for American refiners, the lesson is perhaps the clearest of all. Political relationships can change very quickly. Refinery infrastructure the pipelines cannot be rebuilt overnight. The crude requirements cannot be rewritten overnight. And billions of dollars of investment cannot simply disappear because politicians have changed their tone. So Canada's latest resistance to Washington should be watched closely, not because it automatically means American gas stations are about to run dry. They are not, but because it signals something bigger,